this question for you.
Okay. That might be the answer.
We on?
Go.
Okay, well, I have several pages of notes here. I don't know where to start other than to say I think the conference was a smashing success. We had a small group here, lots of great interaction, lots of great fellowship, lots of people watching live streaming online. People will continue to listen and evaluate what we had to say here when the whole conference is posted on Paul's Passing Thoughts. The videos, the high definition videos will be posted along with all the slides in order, so that's going to be a very long post. But people can go there and feast on everything that has been said here. Where to start, other than to say that TANC is really an organization that, of course, as John knows, and our guest contributor of the roundtable here, Zach, who is the author of what blog?
It's unreformingtheology.com. It's wildly unpopular, very small. Not wildly unpopular as in nobody likes it. It's wildly unpopular that I have a small readership. So
Right. Though we're TANC, definitely we consider ourselves biblicist, okay? And I'm not sure John would put himself in that camp per se, nor you. But still, you guys play a very important role, and John has played a very important role to our organization, and that the things discussed here at the conference are very real, and Christians need to be educated on it. And though we have some differing views on authority, still, when it gets right down to the nitty-gritty, a lot of what you said in this conference read my life for the past 20 years. And I think our lives for the past couple of years, and that this is interesting that the Lord still brought Susan and I together, because Susan was very much in the same collectivist mindset that most Protestants are in when we met, because of what I had went through in the past 6 years ago. I was well past that. All right. I had determined that, I was going to pursue, and I think basically backing up a little bit, I became a Christian in 1983, and shortly thereafter have known all of my Christian life that something was fundamentally wrong with the American church. But I never was able to figure it out until what happened to me, coupled really with meeting you, okay, being introduced to you. I was well past that. Community was very important to you. And starting the Potter's House and having this home fellowship here was a big step for you, and a vote of confidence for me, and really primarily a support for me, which of course is much appreciated. I think Susan and I see what you said point blank, and that, when Susan and I visited several churches, gave up, left one particular church where she had many friends, so on and so forth. Once you're no longer a part of that group, poof, okay? Susan hasn't had a phone call from, shall I say the name of the church? Probably that would be uncouth.
I'd rather you not.
No, but, you know, it's just, it is this collectivist mentality. And so, John,
before you ask me a question, I want to comment on something to those
Good.
watching. Paul said something key, that it took him a while to get out from underneath his mindset. And he mentioned that it took Susan a while to come around and to understand. And I know with other people, I've talked to a lot of people about this. And I want to tell people, for those of you who haven't heard me before, I've been working on this, some facet of this, probably since college. And I graduated in effectively 1990. So I've been at this almost 25 years. My goal here is not a credential. I'm trying to give you a sense of proportion. How long it can take. Now, I had to pretty much blaze this trail myself. I had to dig around a lot to find some resources. I've connected the dots, and so your detox time can be substantially shorter. It takes a lot. The fear that is implicit to these doctrines, the extortion that is built into the doctrines is designed to play on your fear. It's designed to drive you to terror. One of the fun things, which I think is strange that I should have to point this out, because Luther's proper distinction between law and gospel is predicated on human despair and the wrath of God. Probably one of the most famous sermons on the planet is Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The entire function of that sermon was to drive people to utter absolute terror. So for many of you, you're looking at your life and you hear what I say and you go, oh, eureka. And then you say to yourself, but I'm still scared. How do I fix this? Well, your fear is directly proportional to your sense of impotence. You genuinely feel that there is some form of fight, some form of conflict that you cannot specifically overcome. That you genuinely believe some form of harm. Now, probably most of that in the modern age is entirely made up in your head. The real power, these men don't have any real civil power. But the fact of the matter is they only have a collectivist force. They only have a force in as much as they can marshal the general opinions of their local communities to bring some form of bad thing to your life. But here's what you must realize. You don't have anything from them. They really are not offering you anything. You are ultimately losing nothing because you don't have what they're telling you have anyhow. The moment you're not part of the collective, the reason they go poof is because you were never really a substance or a value in their minds at all. You were merely a means to an end. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't some people that can do bad things. That goes without saying, I suspect. But the nature of your fear, being able to unwind this will dissipate directly proportionate to how much you become successful at mastering the concepts that I've been talking about. The better you are at being able to offer a counter argument, and there's been other discussion before we actually got online, and people were talking about, well, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have the words to explain it. Well, what that really tells me is that you didn't have an intellectual counter to what you were hearing. That they were offering an argument that you didn't know how to respond to. The more you get better at answering those questions, the more you are snappy off the cuff. They come at you with determinism, your immediate response is, then why are you trying to persuade me? The moment they believe in predestination or any form of determinism, there is no rational argument to be had. There is no persuasion to be had. So their obsession with carrying on a rational conversation is entirely inconsistent. I ultimately contend that Calvinists pound their doctrine and then go live like an Arminian. They still tend to presume and to function in the earth as if the nature of their persuasion is ultimately necessary for somehow your good, which is entirely absurd based on their own ideas. the better you get at being quick with, say, the response that I just gave, and the more you come to understand that the nature of your morality is your friend, that your ethical value is directly proportional to the good of your life, the prosperity of your life, the blessing of your life, the less you're going to be intimidated by what they have to say. Because eventually the bell's going to go off. Exactly what can they do to me? And whatever they can do to me, am I willing to give up liberty to avoid it? And the answer to that is never. If you're going to take my liberty, you've already taken my life. I'll go to war. How about that? And for the most part, I think you'll find is that once you actually take an absolutist stand, I know a lot of people struggle with openly saying this is evil. Not, kind of, sort of, not just some bad ideas. No, these guys are just misled. None of that. The closer you get to being able to say that is the more you will realize that your fundamental liberty and your fundamental freedom is specifically defended by being bold. The dynamic for me has always been, I stand up, I'm forceful, they shut up, they get rid of me. I stand up, I'm forceful, they shut up, they get rid of me. What I ultimately realized was they were terrified of me. They were terrified of the ideas, not me specifically, but the ideas that I was able to articulate. So your goal in all of this, the thing that will unravel it for you, is gaining your own mastery of the things, the elements, the principles that I'm talking about. And then one day, and it'll take a while, number of years maybe, the detox takes a while, and that's okay. Take your time, you'll get there. But the day will come when you're able to look yourself in the mirror and go, what can they take from me? And that will be a great day.
And speaking to that, when I was in the situation I was in, as a biblicist even, okay, it came down to me wrestling for a number of days, searching the scriptures for a number of days, where I was asking myself and trying to evaluate who has the authority here. And this is after being held hostage for almost 4 months. If you take your family and leave, we'll ruin your reputation, okay? So anyway, I was actually, and what does this tell you? I was wrestling through the scriptures in prayer and wrestling through the scriptures. Where was the authority? With the Word of God or in them? Okay? If I concluded unequivocally that the scriptures contradicted what they were saying, should I leave anyway, no matter what happened to me? Now, what does this tell you about where we're at? And I was a pastor, still am, consider myself a pastor, by the way. Where are we at when a pastor in that situation is wrestling with that issue? As a Christian for how many years, a pastor, I myself didn't know right off the cuff who had the authority. All right? I think as Christians, we don't realize how deep this orthodoxy thing is driven down in our psyche, or whatever you want to call it. Brainwashed, conditioned. Now, John, you said that you've been talking to the air for 20 years, and the point I want to make here is that if you read False Reformation, which is a book I recently published, the Truth About New Calvinism, you're like, if you interpret the Bible literally, this is pretty obvious. And Susan and I started saying this in our study of the book of Romans. It's obviously doctrinally, and this is the beautiful thing about this, you kind of cover the philosophical, worldview of how we look at this. I kind of take care of the doctrinal aspect, and Susan is always the people person who wanders about horizontally, blessing everybody's life, okay? The experiential aspect, if you will. And that worked beautifully last year. But the philosophy is all important because I deal with the doctrinal issues because these guys, again, didn't search the scriptures day and night under candlelight and come away with these doctrines. They came to the Bible with a philosophy, okay, with an ideology. Now, I'm over here, they're here, the Bible's here, I'm over here trying to explain to people where it comes out wrong, okay? You're here showing where the philosophy is wrong. Is that a fair assessment?
That's pretty good.
Okay. With that said, I don't consider myself a hyper-intelligent person by any means. There's people in the past, I've been thinking about this for months, there has been past movements that tried to make a ruckus about this.
Yes, there are.
Okay.
It's happened over and over. Correct.
But we're presented with a unique opportunity because we're in the information age. Okay? This offers a unique opportunity because we can just keep pounding our arguments and the truth. We can just keep pounding it day after day after day after day. And there's nowhere for them to hide and there's nowhere for them but that particular tool in the hands of people who have nothing more to lose, okay, and who have rejected the premise, as you say, is I look at, we're in a unique opportunity, but what Susan and I are pretty convinced of is everything needs to be reevaluated, and that's what we're doing.
Well, let me make a comment. And I've said this, I actually said this, I think, in one of my discussions, and I've talked to this to other people. The reason Calvinism gets so much traction is because it gives man a place to hang his intellectual head. Mm-hmm. It gives him a comprehensive, because man is an integrative creature, he's an abstracting creature, a conceptual creature. The way he deals with the world is by that, the 7 steps to better earwax concept, the way we get our motivational power. Our motivational power is it comes from our ethics. The content of our conduct, how we move towards values, comes from our epistemology. So my point here is this: the reason that the counter-revolutions have never stuck is because, for the most part, the counter-revolutions are driven by personalities. Probably the greatest example of this, and you church buffs actually watching, and you church history buffs, you'll know that American Christianity has had a dividing line. For the most part, you had the Puritan axis that was the dominant theme in most of the Eastern churches, and then the Eastern universities, which would be Yale and Harvard and so forth. Most of those were the factories, the intellectual factories, continuing to perpetuate the Reformed tradition. And that's because Calvin successfully built a systematic presentation of these doctrines. And because man is a systematic creature, that's, at the end of the day, he gave answers for the big picture. The counterpart of that is that Christianity, because the United States in its conception protected religious freedom, you had a lot of men who had the ability to rise up because they picked up the book, they read the red, and they go, oh, wait a minute, that's not what it says. And those men, right around the turn of the 19th century, the first Pentecostalish movement actually took off. And it was funny, in one of Paul's charts, he's got that 2-man chart. And on the left side of the chart, you've got the guy that's supposed to be downcast and guilty, and you've got these changes on the inside of man, and that's the glory story, meaning that's the self-aggrandizing man story. You've got Pentecostalism. Well, the reason these guys reject Pentecostalism for the most part, because at the root of the Pentecostal expectation is that the individual is empowered with efficacious power. His life can now become effective. Well, the sources of these doctrines came from the revival movements that started effectively with like John G. Lake, John Alexander Dowie. And that was probably the 2 names that come off the top of my, they were saying that in turn of that's about 1905. So those were the initial stages of a revivalist movement and of course these were the foundations, the beginnings of the Pentecostal movement. But then they actually had the secondary revival started in the late 20s, and eventually took shape under a man by the name of William J. Seymour. He was a one-eyed black man that ultimately started the Azusa Street Revival, and from the Azusa Street Revival came the Foursquare denomination, Pentecostal, Church of God in Jesus Christ, and a number of other Pentecostal-style denominations. So what you have is this open rejection between the Reformed construct and the Pentecostal movement. Now, the problem with the Pentecostal movement has always been is that they are personality driven. The man of God is the one endowed with the power to do the healing. And so you have John Alexander Dowie in Zion, Illinois, healing the sick so much that he can write Christ the Healer, Isaiah 53 verses 4 and 5 in braces and crutches and the whole bit. But it was driven by his personality, and it ultimately corrupted by his personality. The same is true of every subsequent problem. And the moves of the Spirit have always descended into these subjective evolutions. So what ends up happening is the second or third generation looks around and goes, so where do we do? What do we do next? We no longer have the galvanizing personality. What do we do next? And it falls on its face. And so all that is left is for the subsequent generations to say to themselves, well, where do we go for a comprehensive system? Alakazam poof, everybody starts reading the Reformers. They have all the systematic answers, and now you have the resurgent Calvinist move coming across once again. And this goes to my direct point. If we're going to, and I've said this to Paul on a number of occasions, he says everything that should be challenged. Everything should be challenged. Everything should be rethought from the beginning. But that requires tripping way far down a rabbit hole. And until you're willing to do that, the reason this is always divided between collectivist doctrines and individual doctrines is because Christianity has almost never defended the individual, ever. And it was only in the United States that we even got close. And that was actually a political movement that was actually initiated by the Founding Fathers. And they couldn't quite decide where to land on the issue of Christianity because they were, in many instances, they were fundamentally hostile to the Christianity, the Reformed construct that was at the heart and soul of, say, the Massachusetts theocracy. So the thing that has never been done, and the invitation here, the real thing is a comprehensive systematic rebuttal, not just the typical Arminian counter-arguments. I'm talking about a full and entire systematic reevaluation of what it means to be Christian and what specifically it stands for. Because the reality is, if the Reformed construct is Christianity, and if you find yourself objecting to Christianity, the only logical conclusion is to reject Christianity. And this is what inevitably drives the atheist movements in our current culture. So the choice before us is to actually do the work, to reevaluate the entire philosophical statement, and then to offer a counter statement, one that is superior in every rational perspective. So that's the challenge before us. It's not just rejecting them. That's the easy part. That's been done a few dozen times throughout the last 500 years. The hard part, what has never been done, is the counter philosophy that establishes, that relates Christianity with life and life with the life of the individual. That's never really been done.
I would like to speak to that. And your point on atheists, the problem here is atheists base a lot of their argument, tell me if I'm wrong, on the ideology of Protestants and the Reformation, from what I've heard, at least the bunch I've kind of tangled with. Okay, the determinist philosophy, so on and so forth. Now that may not be your experience. Okay.
Well, determinism, there's materialistic determinism, which we discussed, which is
right.
Pretty much the advent of the atomists. But there are many forms of determinism. Predestination of the Calvinist variety, the Augustinian variety, is just one sub-argument of the whole determinist construct.
And I don't want to get us down on a rabbit track, because I'm getting away from the point I want to make, and it's my fault, I got you down on the rabbit track. But you said in your talk, when good men do nothing,
Yes.
all right, so let's talk about this. whoever fights evil is usually somebody who's following their conscience, and you may say they're not good, but at least they're trying to do something good, call them good men, whatever. But if anybody does anything against evil, something that's truly evil, that's going to be good people. That's the assumption. But we have a problem here. Calvin et al. Say that nobody's good. Game over, right? Embrace tyranny. It is what it is. Only good men are going to confront evil, but hark, no one's good. So shut up, listen to the sermon, and give your money to the church. As Mark Driscoll himself said on a video that was emailed to me a week ago, quote, shut up and do what you're told. Okay? So it's kind of like this whole total depravity of the saints thing. Now, they don't say total depravity of the saints, but that's what it is. Game over, right?
Correct. That's exactly right.
Okay. Now, and don't let me forget to highlight Susan's a couple of comments that she made. But let's think about this in the context of the parable of the talents and what you said about individualism, being responsible for our own lives. There's something that I've got a lot of note here. Man is not a collective being. Ambition is a synonym for sin. I read a lot of Luther, absolutely, every other sentence. Okay. Let me see here, what else? I've got another arrow going to the parable of the talents. But the point I want to make is, John, in that parable, are you familiar with it? Okay, the parable of the talents. Each of those servants are responsible for their own gifts.
Yes.
And he goes to them, there's an individual accounting
Correct.
for the talents they had been given by the master of the house. We assume that's God. And they were responsible themselves for giving God back a return on that. All right? Then we come down to the last servant that the master's not happy with. And he hid his talents in the ground. And when the master came back, gave whatever was given to him back to the master because of fear.
Correct.
I see a lot of, is it just me, or are there a lot of correlations here?
I think there's an absolute correlation. I mean, for heaven's sake, the master of the house comes back and says, why didn't you even you had this. If you were afraid, instead of burying it in the ground, why didn't you at least take it to the bank and let somebody else work with it? To give me at least some increase here. The absolute assumption here, and of course the master of the house says, you think you were afraid of me? You were afraid of me. Your reason for doing this is because you were afraid of me? I think this absolutely speaks to personal accountability. I marvel that this gets so little traction in our thinking. We are responsible for the return on the investment. In other words, as individuals, our commission is to increase our capital. That is our commission. And so the notion that you can live in a zero-sum game, you show up in life, and at the end of your life, all you can ever hand back is the zero sum of whatever you were given. I think that parable should make you quake in your boots. If you're not making a concerted effort to get in the business of doubling and tripling what you've been given.
And John, again on collectivism, okay? Again on collectivism. The Tower of Babel. The Trinity said that all having the same language and as one, working towards a particular goal was a bad thing, right? That's what we have here.
What we have here is the means to the end was the problem.
Right.
And the ultimate goal.
Let us make a name for ourselves.
Let us make a name for ourselves, because actually, in contrast to the progression, I'll draw your attention to this. They say, "Let us make a name for ourselves." In other words, as a group, the collective group. But notice that what God says to Abraham, or Abram at the time, "I will make your name great." The reason we know Abram and Abraham, think of this. Contrast the story of Abraham to, say, the story of Hercules.
Mm-hmm.
Or who was it that fought Tiamat and Enkidu in the Babylonian Genesis? I can't think of his name off the top of my head. These men, the ancient stories, were all of these demigod kind of things. They were these kind of personifications of these supermen. But they were very obviously not stories about an individual. And they always did these Herculean acts. And of course, the principle in those ancient stories was that these were somehow these idealized forms they were a collectivist ideal. The story and discussion in the book of Genesis and the story of Abraham stands that convention on its ear. We have now, suddenly, God discussing the individual blessing of an individual man. The man is who received the reputation. His greatness was his own. Mm-hmm. Now watch what happens next. And this always kills me when I hear people talking about that the Bible is somehow misogynistic. It's absolutely not. Because notice, we know the name Sarah. You can't find a tradition in the ancient world where the woman, unless she was some form of deity, was brought to the forefront. This was an evolution within context to that time frame. This was an evolution of thought. You have the greatness of a man and the greatness of a woman who became, of course, what we now know as the father of many nations. And I always marvel at this because the nature of Abraham's greatness, so think of this. Abraham was so fundamentally superior to all of the tribes around him. He was a moving, mobile city. And he'd become exceedingly wealthy. And he was so successful. The nature of his greatness was so successful. And everybody knew the source of that greatness was his covenant with this obscure God. Yahweh was no one in the ancient mind. That they were willing to cut off body parts to participate. I don't have people willing to cut off their fingernails to participate with me.
And we could get down the rabbit track of the daring, it would be a great conversation, we just didn't have time for it. Your daring comment, if I interpreted what you said right, was that really the major theme of the Bible is the Abrahamic covenant. Not the cross.
Correct. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, now that's anathema in our day. Okay,
Well,
but what we're saying in our study of the book of Romans is that what's paramount, how the Bible concludes in the same way it begins, is with the promise. Okay?
Correct. A Bible study that would be good for everybody to do is to understand what it means, the covenants of promise, to understand what the covenants of promise were. And I guarantee you, if you actually make an effort to find that out, you'll be like, wait a minute, what have I been taught all my life?
And that's where we're at.
And the second Bible study you need to do is to understand the gospel.
Yeah.
The gospel.
The gospel. What did Jesus preach? And I will give you a hint. It starts in Luke 4 and about verse 16 and goes to verse about 23, I believe.
And it's pretty apparent that that's what it's saying he's doing. So.
Yeah, and once you actually wrap your head around what he preached, the correlation between what he preached and what he did, and then notice in Acts 10:30, starting at about 36, going to about 40, 41, Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. Notice that Peter says it was this message that was preached from the beginning. And make the correlation between what Peter is talking about in the beginning, which is in Nazareth, which is the Luke account. When you actually begin to realize that the monolithic theme that they were talking about is that Jesus, Messiah, Jesus Christ, Jesus anointed. Those three words, Christ, Messiah, and anointed, are actually all the same word. And that the nature of what that anointing was designed to do, you are within striking distance of understanding the implications of the covenants and promise.
Well, and I want to reiterate what a girl said to me online, a Calvinist, okay? And this kind of gets back to my original, in discussing the parable of the talents, individualism. She said, if I live by faith alone, and I don't try to do anything in my life by my, quote, own efforts, okay? I'm playing it safe because when I get to the judgment, God can't judge me. All right? And unfortunately, tell me if I'm wrong, that's probably indicative of the mentality that we have in the church today, to a great degree.
In my mind, that is the mentality described in the parable of talents, straight up.
Right. Now, would you attribute that to this constant thrashing of individualism for hundreds and hundreds of years in the church?
Absolutely. That's exactly where it's at.
Okay. And if anybody wants to jump in here, I'm kind of going by my notes. We can't discuss everything, but I'm trying to go through and hit the highlights here. Here at the Potter's House, we're looking more and more at...
I mean, to talk about that a little bit, I mean, I think that assumption is rooted in the idea that it's actually possible to do nothing. There's no such thing as doing. There's no such thing as doing nothing.
Amen. Preach it. Yeah.
You know,
exactly.
We constantly get involved with bringing in theoretical, absolute, infinite abstractions and creating them as something real that we can actually apply into our life. And the whole idea of doing nothing is a perfect example. The idea that you can sit before God and declare you can't be judged because you did nothing is totally rationally inconsistent. You're going to be judged on what you
Not
do
if
because there's
sanctification's by grace alone.
well, that's what I'm. But see, again, that is a product of living by external theoretical standards, which are totally mutually exclusive to reality. You must do. You can't live and not do. You're going to be judged on what you do. If you do nothing, that's not doing nothing. You have decided to do something instead of doing what you were supposed to do.
Non-action is still an action.
Is that right?
Exactly
So
right.
you say nothing is still something.
And here is where
There's no such thing as
Christians
nothing.
err grievously in philosophy, because I can tell you there is complete no knowledge, non-knowledge, however you want to say it, in the whole area of anthropology. And that's why in our study of Romans, I did 4 studies on what I called divine anthropology. Remember that? Is it sinful for a Christian to utilize the anthropomorphical aspect of the fact that as creatures we're born creatures of habit? So is it unspiritual for a Christian to utilize that concept to be better for God? Or is that obeying in our own efforts rather than the Holy Spirit obeying for us? This is a whole area that Christians have not been taught in and are completely ignorant
The
of.
whole problem is the assumption that you can actually not exist, that you can exist outside of yourself, that you can
Right.
divorce you from you. And the problem is, Christians are constantly told that they're the problem. Their existence is the problem. You look at these absolute ideas, total depravity, biblical roles, everything that's true is outside of you. You're the problem, okay? And so we accept this idea that you can be nothing, you can't exist, so that when you get before God, you don't have any responsibility because you don't really exist. At best, you're the problem. So the more you distance yourself from yourself, the better off you are. Well, people are going to be in a rude awakening because you cannot remove yourself and function in some kind of theoretical, external to you, absolute construct that can't and doesn't actually exist. And we
Actually,
see this.
let me comment, because I want to explain why what he is saying, why the metaphysical premise that what he's saying is so important. Remember in the discussion when I was discussing Zeno's paradox, that you effectively can't cross the same room, you can't cross a room, because it is the argument to the half-life of infinity. Here is why that argument falls apart. Infinity is not an identity. Infinity is a theoretical construct, and this is important. It is not a particular. So it is not measurable. So it's not a thing. So you can't subdivide a non-thing. Does that make sense? You can only subdivide a known quantity. So you can cross a room because you can cross a known quantity. So the point that he's making is he is actually rebutting the same concept only applied to this moral construct of total depravity. Well, what you're telling me is that you have an undefinable depravity but that is not a thing. It is not quantifiable in any specific sense. So depravity, the actions, depraved actions, are discrete moments, discrete events, discrete ethical lapses. So there is no such thing as a total depravity. There is the long-standing manifestation of ongoing actions that are depraved. So once you understand that there is no such thing, and then now you can go back to your argument, because this is exactly how Aristotle unraveled that infinite regress of Zeno, but it's the exact same argument. Remember, all of this has all of its roots all the way back to the beginning. We're still trying to unravel the metaphysical construct that has been forced upon us. The pervasive depravity argument is nothing more than the Zeno argument established to man. Back to you.
No, I appreciate that, because I think it's difficult when I say biblical roles and total depravity to get to where I'm going, but you did that for me. I appreciate. I was telling you a story the other day. I was reading a book called The God Particle, and the author, I think, is Dr. Lederman, is a guy who does not like Aristotle. I've only read about half the book, but he constantly rages sort of against Aristotle. The Aristotelian assumptions were opposed to what was true and scientific, and I thought that this was strange. I was confused because I thought Aristotle was a man of logic, and I would think a scientist would like logic. I realized that the problem that he had is the same problem that Calvinists have. The same problem that religion has is the same problem that I notice that certain scientists have, is the belief that nothing can actually exist. And not only does nothing exist, but nothing is what actually drives reality. If you look at physics, all reality is governed by laws, by abstract concepts that exist somewhere in the ether, somewhere beyond what we consider observable and real is a law. You can't quantify it, you can't grab it. It's infinite apart from the things it observes, but it's real. And that is what actually governs actions. So at his root, this Dr. Lederman is a scientific determinist. He believes that all observable reality is dictated by external to reality laws that we can't observe. It's the same thing with Calvinism. It's the same kind of determinism. It is fundamentally, let me finish saying this, removing you from you. That's the point.
Right.
You can't possibly be you in light of any of these constructs. And if that's true, you can never have a remonstrance against C.J. Mahaney or your pastor or the collective, because you are, by definition, these abstract concepts.
Correct. Good job. Good job. That's perfect.
And the reason all of this is important from a biblicist point of view is that if you can create your own reality, you win the argument every time, right?
That's right.
If you can create your own reality, you can proof text this thing until whatever you want to do.
And in my biblicism, where I am on this right now, in my biblicism, in my 6 years of studying New Calvinism, they are in the process, and let me tell you something, they're that far from having it wrapped up, of creating a whole different reality construct and a whole different metaphysical metaphysics that Christians think within. okay? Here's how, because as you know, I haven't delved much into this, but here's how I explain it right now. Right now, in my infancy of studying this, based on Genesis and so forth, I believe God created the world to be interpreted grammatically. We interpret things with words, okay?
Actually, let me make one adjustment. We use words to describe our conceptual faculty.
Right. As I said, this is my infancy
That's fine.
part of this. However, on the other side, New Calvinism, and I believe they do get this directly from authentic Calvinism, is creating a reality where words do not interpret reality. And look, this thing started at the Academy, and I want to make this point because in my next book I'm going to discuss Popper a lot. If that's the print. K.L. Popper, he wrote, give me a second here, I will be discussing much The Open Society and Its Enemies by K.R. Popper, The Spell of Plato. All right. This thing went from the Academy, left and right. Left into secularism, ended up communism, okay? And to the right, it ended up Catholicism, and from Catholicism, we get, the Reformers, good Protestants, like all sitting in this room and listening right now, all right? And so I'm going to be discussing him a lot, but this whole thing of interpreting all reality, and they say this plainly, all reality, words don't mean things. In the words of Rick Holland, a close associate of John MacArthur, good grammar is just guardrails for communication. He said this, page 27, I believe, in his book, Uneclipsing the Sun. Good grammar is a guardrail for communication, but often gets in the way of the truth. All right? And what kind of stuff comes out of that? Here's the kind of stuff that comes out of it. John MacArthur in an interview saying that his people obey God when they don't even realize they're obeying God, because the Holy Spirit's doing it for them. They don't even, and I have several quotations from people like this. So, all reality, which is this is the first tenet of New Covenant theology, which half the New Calvinists out there, and I quote, all reality is interpreted through Christocentricity. All right? Jesus Christ, and listen, there's two kinds of Christians in the church. Those who are Calvinist and know they're Calvinist, and those who deny they're Calvinist, don't think they're Calvinist, but function like Calvinist. Okay? This is why growing up as a new Christian in the church, I couldn't figure out why all of the emphasis on the gospel. Getting people to church to get them saved. All of this stuff. So basically, they've made Jesus Christ and His works a stargate to determining reality for however it pleases God, because He only sees it. We live in the world of subjectivity.
Correct.
And we go about our life in the world, and good things happen and bad things happen, and we never know when God's doing it through us or it's us, so really we're concerned with it. Just meditate on Christ, be a good Christian, don't worry about your gifts, don't worry about your moral responsibility before God. Give 10% of your money and more to the church, shut up, listen to the sermon, and smile. Okay? And this is what I've seen in the church all my life. Susan, why don't you say something? I know you're the good listener and the people person and all this, but you gave 3 sessions, and of course, John and I got dissed by Pastor David by quoting the
good
you
wine.
guys
The good
saved
wine.
the good wine to
For
the
last.
end of the conference. Okay.
That's fine.
But you have, the quote from the Yale professor here, Roland Bateman, quote, if Calvin ever wrote anything, kind of getting back to individualism, if Calvin ever wrote anything in favor of religious liberty, and this kills me because International Religious Freedom Day came from the fact that Puritans, Calvinistic Puritans, hung 3 Quakers in Boston. Okay? But yet these guys are heroes. I'm sorry to... How can you not overreact?
Well,
Where are our
the reason why
brains?
you're over it, it's easy. You have to understand that reality always comes second
Right.
to something else, which means that you always come second to something else, which
Right.
really means that you either don't exist, or if you do, you're totally irrelevant. So
Right.
when you can think in their terms, all of this makes sense. I went down this path because I was in SGM for 15 years, and I saw what was going on, I saw the hypocrisy, and I said to myself, a lot of these pastors I know, these are not evil guys. I mean, they're not clinical narcissists, they're not psychopaths, they're not people who, well, I mean, you could say,
I'll go with that for now.
I'm not saying, you could say there's some issues in the leadership that would, that it would be hard to say they weren't conscious of the outcome of this. But I'm talking, pastors in local churches, home group leaders, people that I knew were affirming the actions. And I said, these are not people, these are not clinical psychos, bad people. So I said, what makes them sleep at night? How am I seeing this? And so distraught, and it's okay with them. And I concluded it had to be the doctrine. So I read you, people who read my blog, I'm a lot on Wartburg Watch, know that I got the idea that I could actually formulate I got the idea that I could defend my faith and my reality according to reason, the ability to reason. I could make a consistent logical argument for what I believed. I got that from John, which is why I lift so much stuff from John, a lot of what he says, because it's so good. So I went down this path, and I realized that the huge metaphysical discrepancy was the idea that people can't seem to recognize the difference between what is an abstract, infinite concept and what is real. So they can't make a difference between their physical selves and the external abstraction that they somehow try to incorporate themselves into, whether it's the collective, whether it's an external standard of morality to themselves, all these kinds of things. But what I realized was that everything you're saying, that people throw up their hands and go, it doesn't make sense, I don't understand it, this is crazy. If you recognize that you're secondary to what is real, which is the thing that you can't see, that's outside you, that only a few people somehow have privileged information, they're divinely inspired or whatever, they're born in Plato, they're born with this, some innate ability to be the bridge between the non-reality, the illusion of you, and the real divine truth. Once you make the connection that you're not really you, and you're kind of irrelevant because you don't really exist in the construct, it all makes sense, because reality can be defined in any way, at any time, and you can never have any complaint. And that seems crazy, but in light of the doctrine, it makes total sense. Nothing shocks me anymore. Nothing shocks. You think C.J. Mahaney running from CLC and going to Mark Dever's church, in light of all the pastors that had to stay where they were and be under church discipline, or if there was concern who they would have been excoriated for doing it. That does not surprise me at all, because
Nope,
with this construct,
right?
anything really goes, and
Anything
you are
goes.
not in a position to judge because you're not divinely dispensed to really get, because you don't have that connection with
And this
the
was,
truth.
and what he said is exactly C.J. Mahaney's defense. Yeah, guys, we're talking about you. His C.J. Mahaney's defense of himself was he had not been given grace to perceive. He didn't recognize that things were bad because God had somehow not infused his soul with the truth. So this is exactly what he's saying. The reality had not been prescriptive for CJ's senses to somehow magically alakazam poof go, oh yes, this is a moral problem, and I am somehow responsible. So he was able to rewrite reality in service to his own vindication. Well,
Right.
that's insanity on its face. I mean, I'm not trying to give a clinical definition here, but the reality is that is insanity. The inability to be able to identify an objective reality is insanity. And the entirety of this doctrine revolves around this ability to magically alakazam poof, reality is something else, and you don't matter.
And they are the gatekeepers of the Christocentric reality.
Yes. they are.
Okay? So basically, we have this quote here: if Calvin ever wrote anything in favor of religious liberty, it was a typographical error. We liked that, highlighted the conference. And another the one that Susan came up with in her, and this so says it all. You know, this so says it all. In Sermon 46, Augustine commented to his parishioners that while in the beginning the apostles were fishers of men, now Christians must be hunters of men, hunters, beating the thickets and driving the wandering sheep into the nets that will save them. He believed that identifying the civil authorities as the servants who were sent out by the Lord of the banquet to gather the, I can't pronounce that word.
The recalcitrant guests were at least,
Yeah, notice how the method of compelling is always some sort of violence.
violent.
Oh.
You don't compel by the force of your ideas. You don't compel because there's great food. The idea was, well, it's going to be force of some kind.
Well, and Augustine even said that. He said at one of the councils, we tried to talk you into coming back to the church. We tried to talk you into giving up your heresies.
Correct.
But it didn't work. So now it's your fault that we have to use force.
Right.
But at some point they realize that the talking is irrelevant. If they have been given the authority to use force is most effective, they just go straight for force at some point. But that goes back to your idea that if certain people were to get civil authority, they finally clicks. Well, why bother with trying to rationalize?
Why bother with an
Why bother
argument?
reason?
God has given me the authority to use force. But in a democracy, look at the kind of power that this gives a pastor. A pastor gets to play both sides of the coin at the same time. He can be divinely dispensed to interpret reality for everybody and to declare what is and what you should do unequivocally, with no challenge whatsoever. And yet if things go pear-shaped in a democracy like this, where we have a civil government that's not religious, things go pear-shaped, there's abuse, there's fallout, it becomes known, they can retreat into the, I'm just a sinner.
Yeah.
I'm no more human than you. I'm no more real than you. If I haven't been divinely given. I didn't perceive reality, but that's obvious because you and I were the same. We're both sinners. You can't judge me. I'm just another sinner. But for the grace of God, go I. And they get to play two sides of this coin, which gives them enormous power. They can do anything they want, and always be perpetually completely innocent. Completely innocent of any action.
And you have just laid out the specifics of why I say this body of doctrine, the Neo-Calvinist doctrine, at its root is the flip side of the antinomian coin. On one instance, I'm a
Right.
sinner and I can't help but sin, and the other one is, for heaven's sake, I just lost my train of thought.
The two sides of the coin, antinomian and
One side says we don't have to keep the law.
Right,
The other
right.
side of the
Yeah,
coin
that's what it
says we can't keep the law.
Right, that's exactly right.
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 That's right, yeah. Thanks, Paul.
But jumping off of his point, all right, and something that I learned from Susan from her research, okay, was, as you guys know, I was greatly interested in the biblical counseling movement. And the biblical counseling movement, as we see it right now, BBC, CCEF, and NAG control easily well over 90% of the biblical counseling in this country right now. And the counseling is predicated on this collectivism that you're talking about to a T, the cross chart that we saw. It's all predicated on that, which is disastrous. But that's something to think about, and I lost my train of thought there, so let me jump directly into the whole abuse issue. 2 questions for John, because I lost my thing on that, but a thing that I will, so many things came to mind when you were talking, the recent quotation by James MacDonald, "I quit, I resign. I am done fixing people," okay, because they can't be fixed. So the best thing you can do, because you can't be fixed, and this is his sermon to a T, the best thing you could do, because you can't be fixed, is contribute to the collective whole of the church, and if you don't, we'll take you out back and catapult you into the next county. All right?
Wow, there you go.
That is a paraphrase, but not too far from what he really said. Jumping onto that then, now, here it is, right? Tell me if I'm wrong. We got a cover for the pedophile. Yes, what they did was wrong. It was sin, and by the way, we're all sinners. Okay, so let's not pass judgment. But here's the thing, and this has happened to me, personal testimony. Okay? We can't call the police, we can't involve the police because it will hurt the group. Yes, what they did was wrong, but it will hurt the group.
Correct.
Direct quotation from a local pastor to me. "Paul, what they're doing to you is wrong, but you can't do anything about it because it will split the church."
Correct.
Okay? And this is language I've heard all my Christian life since 1983. This collectivism problem that you talked on is the fundamental problem with the church. It's communism with Bible verses hanging from it. The question I want to ask you, during the conference, I gave 4 reasons why New Calvinism always dies. What about this 5th one that I forgot? And what I have seen in these churches. John, does the money not eventually run out because the ambition is sucked out of people? So eventually these movements die because the money dries up. In the American church, you have the same thing that you had in the Berlin Wall that you cited. On the west side, you had prosperity, and on the other side, you had utter poverty. Can you comment on that, any?
Well, of course, and this quote comes from a very wise woman, if the love of money is the root of all evil, the real question is, what is the root of money? And the root of money is little more than the productive efforts, a liquid form of the productive efforts of a human being. The only reason we use a piece of paper in exchange for things is because it's easily transportable between the exchange of values. A barter system is very cumbersome. Having a big stack of gold in your purse is just cumbersome, but that gold, all that gold does is ultimately reflect some form of production by an individual. And how do individuals produce? Well, they produce by the power of their mind, moved into action. That's how they do it. So what then is prosperity? Prosperity is the surplus of that production. Well, the moment you start telling me that I am not free, that my substance can be taken for the collective at will, I stopped producing. So production and prosperity is directly proportional to liberty, which of course the United States is the absolute proof of that reality. The more freedom we have had in the United States, the more we have produced and the more prosperous we've become until we were absolutely the global leader on every level and by any measurement. The decline of American prosperity has been directly proportional to collectivist doctrines' ever-increasing march into some form of tyranny. So the brain drain, the real source of prosperity, is the integrity and the industriousness and the freedom and the liberty of men to produce. Well, the moment you take away from me freedom, the moment you've effectively taken away my liberty, and the moment you've taken away my right to private property, the brain drain begins. And this is why you eventually see flight right out of these congregations.
I read an article yesterday, that's what's happening.
Well, and this is what happens. I remember when I first started going to then Covenant Life Church / PDI, now of course the divided form of Sovereign Grace Ministries. You know, we would see every other Sunday was a parade of people who had achieved some professional status. They, you know, it was the new doctor or the new lawyer or the new whatever the heck, it didn't matter. And they were always commended from the pulpit for their great sacrifice to focus on their families. And they played this elaborate game of their success up against, you know, how they were participating in the collective. And eventually, slowly, and a number of these people in the beginning were, of course, women who were making some sacrifice to then return to the home and raise their children. But inexorably, the trend became more and more and more about removing the pursuit of these other pursuits. The brain drain started because they started retreating into their houses. And ultimately what happens is that anyone who has any ambition to improve themselves is condemned. Well, people can't live that way, and so what they do is they leave. And once they leave, the productive source, the income that they're so very after, the things the money, what that gives them the ability to do, suddenly starts to dry up. And of course, it can never be the doctrine that's at fault. Because, well, if God's giving us money, it's because He loves us, He's blessing us. He's thereby confirming the doctrine. If the money stops coming, well, it's not really about the money, that would be evil. So this is either God's test of our commitment to these ideals, or we just don't have any more interest in money, which is mostly a joke. The fact of the matter is that the brain drain happens regardless. The moment you start to eliminate liberty, you immediately put pressure on people who have the interest in their own betterment. They start leaving. And this is, of course, what you see in every Marxist country on the planet. The moment you start making the government responsible for limiting freedoms, by definition limiting prosperity, the moment that happens, you end up with a brain drain. Now the problem we've got in the world is there's really not too many more places to run. The United States for the longest time was the big outlet. And so people the globe over, the people who were motivated towards liberty, flocked here in droves. The moment the United States descends, and on its present course, we're not that far away, the moment the borders close here, and we are a collectivist tyranny, there just isn't really that many places to run.
Right, and what's scary is that, and I get some information on this, I don't have time to get into it, but I've written on the fact that when you're driving down the road and you see a duck walking down the side of the road, you just know he's heading for a body of water someplace, right? New Calvinists are in process of trying to get in bed with the government. How do I know that? Because that's what Calvinists do. Basically, what they have already done, and this is just a fact, and I've written on it extensively, they have set up a Geneva-like subculture, especially in the large churches, where they don't control people with civil government, but they have come up with other ways
Other methods of social control.
Right. And I could list many of them. One of them is under the table alliances with law enforcement officials and so on and so forth. Personally, I got a call from a police detective that was way out of line. Okay? I probably could have gone to the police station and gotten him fired. But when you're going through this, in one of these bad exoduses, your mind is in a haze, and you're not thinking properly. Thinking back on that now, what the guy did was outrageous, and I should have marched my hiney right into that police station and reported what he did, but he did it at the behest of these pastors. So that's what's going on. There's so much more that we can discuss here. I think the answer to this is home fellowships, home churches, an exodus, come out from among them, okay? And that's Susan and I's vision, that, you know, the Potter's House would grow, that young people would come in, that we can teach this stuff. John, thanks for the great study you did. I know at least one whole segment we'll all just be able to cut and paste into our Bible Institute that we're going to start on the world philosophy aspect. And Susan, we're going to give you the last word, some summary comments on what you think, thought how the conference went, and we will rely on you to give the closing comments.
Good, because my comments will be short.
Okay. It's been a long weekend,
Trying to say.
hasn't it?
What are you trying to say there,
What are you trying to
Susan?
say?
Long-winded men.
Cooked for several people and family, did 3 sessions. Anyway,
Can I take a minute to laud you guys for your individual human worth? You guys were great.
Absolutely.
You guys are very, very, I'm not
Yeah,
saying
yeah.
it's by God's grace, I'm
Yeah,
saying
me too.
you people are very, very, very nice people, and I really appreciate you having
Thank
me.
you.
And it's so nice to have people, you meet people online and you realize, I'm so glad I came here, because you get to make that connection that lets you know what these people are really like. That adds knowing who you are adds even more weight to the message that you guys have, which was already really good. So I think it's important that people understand how just the goodness, inherent goodness in these two human beings is. So thanks for having me.
and
Yeah, and you guys that are mean to this guy over here, cut it out.
Yeah, don't be, you can disagree all you want,
You
it's
can
a free
disagree, but
country.
quit being mean,
But
all right?
here's
don't be
what I
mean.
like about the Word of God,
Oh,
and
now
just
you
think
got
about
started.
this. No, just I'm gonna let you talk. Just think about this. This is how I think, and let me just throw this out here. As a
Sorry,
young Christian, I just read through the whole Bible. All right, and you hear some of the stuff these people say. All right, think about this. The Apostle Paul said, hey, those guys over at, I forget what church I think it was Philippians. Hey, this guy and this guy and this guy, give them honor, because they're worthy of it. Whoa! Okay? You know, just, if Christians would just read their own Bible, take it for what it says, anyway, go ahead, Beth. You're on.
Well, this was a wonderful experience. I have really enjoyed people in the home. We have a big house. It's nice to have bodies walking around, but the conversation and fellowship is awesome. This is why sometimes we didn't start on time, because we were busy being friends and busy getting to know each other and sharing what we know and learn and what God is doing in our own individual lives. I just feel sorry, really sorry, for those people who chose not to come. I mean, I'm talking about local people that we invited. A lot closer than what Zach came. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking about 20 miles from here. We sent out personal invitations to people to come and enjoy the fellowship and learn. And one of my first articles I wrote on Paul's Passing Thoughts was, "My husband provokes me." He provokes me to learn. And I think that's what we need to do with each other, just to provoke each other to learn from God's Word, to learn from each other, and to learn from the world that God has placed us in. What we have to know is just endless, and how we can apply it to our lives to make the changes necessary to make us better for the Lord, our relationships stronger, and our how we work in our workplaces and everything. So I really feel sorry for those people who purposefully chose not to come and be a part of this conference because they either don't like us, or they didn't want to rearrange their schedules, or they just made choices not to come on purpose. I understand about some of my friends wrote back and said, I can't come because I'm out of town, I can't come because of something else. But for those, and I know that there were at least 20, who purposely chose not to come and be a part of this conference because they did not want to hear what we had to say.
They might have to do something about it.
Because they might have to make
Right.
a conscious effort to rethink what they have been taught all of their
Well,
lives. So
It's
maybe
hard.
next year,
In their defense, I mean.
in their defense,
I'm not,
yes.
I've come to the conclusion, I just want to evaluate ideas. I think, I want to try to be as understanding as I can. I value the inherent worth of human beings, and I understand that everybody's different, and I understand that I may not understand ideas or reasons that people do things, and that's okay. That's okay. I think it's a shame that they weren't able to be here and enjoy this, but I understand that people are different, and it's okay to be different. I'll disagree on ideas, but I affirm humanity, and that's, I don't know why I'm saying that. I guess that's the whole point of wanting to do what I do, is to affirm the worth of humanity
Right.
and the decisions it makes for its own good. It is okay with me, even though I may disagree with what they are missing out
And I
on,
think
or even my understanding of their motives. I
That's
guess.
the one thing that always is an irritant to me about comments on my husband's blog. And I even wrote about this, and you can hear me yelling at the house all the time. Why cannot we just discuss ideas? Why do we have to insult,
Yeah.
demean, say unkind, unworthy things about each other? We are discussing ideas, and we should have the freedom to disagree with each other without getting rude and hateful. And when people make rude comments, I automatically disvalue anything else they have to say, because they are not willing to discuss ideas. They want to just discuss their ideas. And that was Calvin. You don't agree with me? Bye. Off with your head, go to jail, be fined, whatever. So again, it's a pattern of learning that they have picked up over time. But we are planning on another conference next year.
You on?
Tentatively, as of right this minute, provided I'm still in the United States, but,
Yeah.
so.
I know it's 12 months away, so a lot could happen. We may not be here, who knows, but we will plan to meet again. And I really am hopeful that Zach and our other friends are able to come back, and that others will join us, so that, we may have to pitch tents in the yard or whatever. But I've truly enjoyed this. I enjoy learning, and I enjoy the fellowship all around. So anyway,
Thank you, absolutely. It's been
Thanks to
great.
your kids.
Absolutely.
You guys have to
Philip?
have kids like them. I've never seen kids with this work ethic.
Yeah, they got a 16-year-old son that has been working nonstop.
Yeah,
Impressive.
Yeah.
Truly
They have
impressive.
impressive kids. They are, we can only hope our kids are like their kids.
Wow.
And that's not hyperbole.
Big thanks to Philip and Ben, and I think he can hear us on the other side of that door. And with that, we'll conclude. Thanks for sticking around,
Absolutely.
fellas.
Thanks.
And Zach, thank you very much.
And I'll go get the lasagna out of the oven.
Time for lunch.
Okay, bye-bye. I'm gonna, I gotta hit the road.
I know you do.
I'm sorry.
I got something for you to take. Do you
Oh, great.
have anything that'll play a USB?